We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked.
And complete the dang fence.
This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill.
Cast down your bucket where you are.
We come from France.
And I am, adamantly against illegal immigrants.
They're coming in by the thousands, just unbelievable.
A wall is an immorality.
Who are you rooting for?
Those masters of the universe are at it again.
You maniac! You blew it up!
Welcome to Parsing Immigration Policy, the podcast of the Center for Immigration Studies. My name is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center. And today we're going to talk about something we've had a podcast about a couple of years ago, but a lot of things have changed since then. And that's the database that we have on our website of national security vetting failures, of people who somehow were not properly vetted or the vetting was unsuccessful and who got through even though they were terrorists or war criminals or spies, or there's a whole bunch of different categories of bad guys who made it through. And the point of the database is to do kind of an after-action report. In other words, what went wrong, where, and the point being to help the government have fewer mistakes like this in the future. I'm not sure the Biden administration particularly cared one way or the other, but the Trump administration is much more serious about this vetting issue. And so to talk about it, the poobah of our database, the one who's collected the information and written the narratives and everything, is with us today. Todd Bensman is National Security Fellow here at the Center, has been on the show a number of times. So Todd, thanks for coming in. And if you could just sort of briefly, why the database of vetting failures is relevant now, more relevant now than, say, it was before, January 20th.
So the reason why the issue of national security vetting is back on the front burner is because President Trump has just signed one of his many executive orders, but this one is really interesting and relevant because it's titled Protecting the United States from Foreign Terrorists and Other National Security and Public Safety Threats. And one of the central thrusts of this particular EO is that it wants to conduct more robust security vetting of all immigrant and non-immigrant visa applicants, and also anybody who has already gotten in who should have been vetted, which is an unusual kind of a tall order.
Right.
We're going to kind of backdate the check on vetting for the last 4 years. So what he's calling on in this executive order is not just robust security vetting for all visa types,
right,
but also to repair and fix problems with national security vetting, to kind of find a baseline that all agencies and all of government, every agency that touches on part of, immigration approvals, including non-immigrant approvals, tourist visas and everything.
Right.
To fix all that, to make sure it's going to slow everything down. It's also going to make the country safer. And it's directed at not just, terrorists, but threat actors of all kinds. That could be Tren de Aragua. It could be, pedophiles from Chile. It could be really all sorts of public safety threats that are not really specified or scoped in the order.
Right.
But it's going to be a whole of government thing. And so, that's something that the Center for Immigration Studies has spent a lot of time with, on failures, vetting failures and tracking them, and really sort of, pushing and advocating for process improvements so that they don't keep happening. And they do keep happening,
right,
far too often.
People want to take a look at it. There's 50 plus cases in there now that Todd has put together. It's on our website, CIS.org. On the right side, there's a thing that says database. And the thing, of course, about it is not that this isn't, kind of just, here's how these incompetents have failed. It's actually, you're trying to identify is these were the agencies where the vetting didn't work, that this guy got through it. And here are ways that you can avoid these problems in the future. In other words, it's the point of it is to assist USCIS and the State Department and whoever else is doing the vetting to do a better job in the future so that there's, fewer failures like this that we would include in a database.
Right. And remember the context, the historical context for this is, of course, 9/11.
Right.
When the country really got together with the legislature, the executive branch, everybody got together and said, we noticed that most of the hijackers got in using immigration fraud of different kinds to get into the country and stay. And we've got to fix our vetting. And so this mammoth project got underway for the next few years after 9/11 to fix those processes, to make sure that, they couldn't game a student visa, they couldn't game a tourist visa and, hide their background, and to get the intelligence databases that could have figured it all out tied together so that we could check all the databases at the same time, classified, to put more intelligence information into them so that adjudicators on the ground had somewhere to bounce inquiries off of.
Right.
But what we've seen in the many years since then is that the failures just continue on and on, with terrorists, with human rights violators, with Chinese spies, with people who are gangbangers, all sorts of threat actors just ridiculously got through our systems anyway and right into the country, potentially to do damage again. And at the very least, for us to catch them and put them through expensive investigative and prosecutorial processes, and maybe even prison, we got to take care of them for 20 years of their sentence. And all of those sort of things are still going on. And there's a cost to it. And sometimes they succeed in attacking, and it would have been an unnecessary attack. And so the point here really is to, show where the weak links still are.
Right.
Lest they be forgotten.
Right, exactly. And the interesting thing is you bring up the 9/11 hijackers. I actually wrote something that referred to this in Saudi Arabia. People won't remember this because it's 24 years ago now. But Saudi Arabia, the U.S. embassy there, the consulate, had something called Visa Express, where people applied for visas in Saudi Arabia. They applied for visas with travel agents and never saw a U.S. government official. And the applications that they submitted, 15 of the 19 visa applications, a journalist whom we gave our journalism award to many years ago was able to get them. The State Department managed to destroy the other 4 before he could get a hold of these 15. And the applications were like a joke. I mean, they just left whole sections blank. Their destination in the U.S., one of them wrote hotel. That was his destination, was hotel. And so, in some cases, the vetting, it wasn't even really any meaningful vetting at all. And so things have improved somewhat since then, but obviously not enough given the number of failures that, we've seen over the past number of years. And so the vetting failures are what, from 2008 on, is that correct?
Yes. We began culling through and reverse engineer analyzing cases from public records, which is always an imperfect method, but it's the best we have. And they're usually cases that have been prosecuted so that we have the benefit of whatever the FBI or HSI, ICE, law enforcement investigations were able to turn up about the visa fraud or the immigration fraud that, allowed this person to skip through. And I picked 2008 because, first of all, that's plenty of time for the post 9/11 reforms to, take root.
Sure.
And to be tested for how well they're doing. And 2, in 2008, there was a a series of improvements in process improvements, adding, social media, adding, doing a lot of requirements for adjudicators, adding requirements. And, it should have fixed a lot of problems. But even since 2008, we're having all sorts of people slip through.
Right.
So on all sorts of different visas, Chinese spies. And so we've added maybe 5 or 6 cases to the database just in the last, 6 months.
Before I want to talk about what are some of the kind of interesting cases of people who got past the vetting, but just to be sort of fair here, the Biden administration did make some, or at least continue some efforts at improving vetting, didn't it? This is something called the Vetting Center, National Vetting Center. What's the, if that's the name correct, what's the story with that? And was that set up under Trump 1 and has it survived the Biden administration? What's the story with that?
Right. Well, to its credit, the Biden administration, one of the few Trump government inventions during his first term was the National Vetting Center.
Mm-hmm.
And, at the time, the kind of rhetoric he used around is we're going to do extreme vetting. We're going to do extreme vetting. And he set up this National Vetting Center, the NVC,
mm-hmm.
and it was operating. The point of it was to put all the different agencies, have representatives in there and start to merge databases, classified and unclassified, law enforcement, intelligence databases with intelligence community classified databases together and be able to project manage certain categories of immigrants. For example, Afghans, when we were bringing in 50,000 Afghans after the fall of Kabul, that sort of thing would go to National Vetting Center. People crossing the border who had, terror, showed up on terror watch lists would go through there often, and, things like that. And they did improve, they kept it. The Biden administration kept it, and it is still there. And I'm guessing that it will probably be further expanded under this new executive order, requiring, very, very robust security vetting for every possible category of foreign national who wants to enter the United States. So they're going to be busy. They're going to need infrastructure. And that is still there for them, for the Trump 2.0.
So this National Vetting Center, presumably there have been more vetting failures since it was established. Has it? I mean, can you assess whether it's been successful? There's obviously no way to know of, which terrorist was identified and kept out, really. But has the National Vetting Center actually, sort of lived up to its promise, even though people presumably have gotten by since it's been established?
No, that's a great question. And it's, of course, hard from the outside to be able to assess how effective it is. But, to be sure, there have been vetting failures since the NVC, took over. For example, the Afghans, refugees being brought in on special immigrant visas. We've seen quite a few of them turn out to be security risks that we should have caught before we let them in. And, there are people who came over the border who were on the terror watch list who, whether they were able to get to it fast enough, kind of were overwhelmed by the numbers or whatever it was. Border Patrol accidentally released them into the country. We've got a whole bunch of those, like 99 of them, and then later, but those are other kind of processes. I'm not sure you can even attribute those to the NVC.
Right. Like, in other words, if the Border Patrol lets somebody go who's on the watch list, but they didn't know he was on the watch list, that kind of thing?
Yeah, the left hand wasn't communicating with the right hand, sort of thing, and
right.
The right email didn't get read or whatever.
Sure.
Things like that were happening. And sometimes the National Vetting Center is only so good as the information that's available to them.
Right.
And not everybody's on a watch list, and not all countries have shareable databases that they can check.
Right. Or they may have them, but don't share them with us because they're not friendly to us.
Exactly. So it's all far from perfect, but it could certainly, all of it could certainly be improved. And I think that the Trump administration's initiative here, while it's incredibly ambitious and not at all clear how they're going to human resource the whole thing,
right,
is still laudable, because there was nothing like this under the Biden administration. They didn't seem all that interested in, doing robust vetting of really anybody. So, or very many. So this is something that I think is, we're going to be all living with this. The whole world is going to be living with this. If you read the text of this executive order, there's no category that escapes this.
Interesting. Now, I want to talk about some of the recent cases just to sort of give examples of the kind of problems you're identifying in the database. But the first point is that you do limit this to people who should have been identified if vetting had been better, right? Because like if somebody comes here at 7 years old with his family, and then when he's 21, he decides he wants to, commit jihad and become a martyr, that's not really something you could have identified. In other words, it's not really like US CIS's or State Department's fault in that case. The cases you're adding here, as I understand it, are ones where somebody should have been able to find out that these people were potential problems, right?
Yes. I'm very judicious about what I include in the database. It has to be a reasonable, from the outside, what looks like they should have been able to find this with just routine, an internet search,
right,
or checking with a government, or interviewing the other family members to see if the story matches up. Things like that they're supposed to do, that they can do, that adjudicators can do and are supposed to do during their processes.
In other words, it's not that our people doing vetting are supposed to be mind readers, and if they can't be mind readers, it's a failure. It's that these are people who should have been flagged with normal routine processes if they'd actually done it.
Yeah. I mean, I exclude a lot of Chinese spy cases, for example, because, spies are trained to be deceptive, to
right,
deceive. And you can't expect some adjudicator to be able to suss out a spy,
right,
a Chinese spy. So they get excluded. On the other hand, some of them are included here because they said that they were not in the PLA, the Chinese military, but all you had to do is Google and there's their picture of them in their uniform with full regalia, right?
Yeah. So what are some of a few of the kind of illustrative cases that you've added over the past, whatever it is, year and a half since we launched, or 2 years since we launched the database?
Well, I mean, a great example is probably the last one that we put in the database, which is about a former state police officer in Brazil who was involved in a mass murder of teenagers in his state. Back home, 11 teenagers killed in retaliation for one of his colleagues being murdered in that neighborhood. None of the teenagers were involved in that murder, but it was just a retaliatory murder spree by these state cops in Brazil.
Right.
And he was arrested and publicly charged
In Brazil. Right.
Yeah, there's all kinds of media about it. And even if there wasn't media where they named him, the Brazilians, we cooperate with them on all sorts of things like this. So, you call the Brazilians up and say, hey, you got anything? So right after he was arrested and charged, he applied for a visitor's visa, a tourist visa in the United States.
In his own name, right? I mean, he wasn't using fake IDs or anything. Unbelievable. Yep.
His own name. And he just was ushered right within a week or so, he had it. And very shortly thereafter, he's in the U.S. applying for asylum and everything else. He's here for 5 or 6 years while his court case is working down there. He is approved for an asylum claim. They didn't catch him there. He's convicted, and only after he's convicted in Brazil in absentia in 2022 did the Interpol put out a red notice, or somebody found the Interpol red notice on him and said, hey, wait, that guy's here in the United States. Let's go round him up. And of course, the ICE agents that did the investigation had no trouble pulling the Brazilian, court records and finding photos and, all that kind of thing. And
Right.
this is a human rights violator. And I would point out that in the DOJ press releases on this case, our U.S. attorneys are saying this guy was extremely dangerous to have in our neighborhoods.
Mhm.
And this guy was a full-on brutal murderer who probably wouldn't hesitate to kill somebody in and around wherever he was at any time. So luckily they caught him, but that's a really obvious kind of case
Mhm.
that goes into the database. And I guess the question for the Trump administration on something like this is, are they going to be looking at the State Department consular office personnel in how they do tourist visas? We give millions of tourist visas out to all kinds of people. The numbers are really high. It's a commerce issue.
Right.
We want to let tourists in and bring them in, but what are you going to do for this? I hope that they look at this one.
So you had another case you'd added was kind of interesting, was a Bosnian war criminal who also apparently because you did a post on this at the blog, this is a case they should have, it wasn't like this guy was a secret of who he was, and yet he got in anyway, right?
That's another one. Another human rights violator was in the Bosnian Croatian militias in the early 90s and was running prison camp. So this guy is conducting just brutal interrogations and kind of wanton murder and killing people and beating and torturing the inmates. And this thing was very well investigated by the international criminal courts. He was named. He testified on behalf of a fellow guard in that. It was all public record. You couldn't miss this if somebody's coming from Bosnia, but he just lied his way in a few years after, in the late 90s, before 9/11, but then after 9/11, he kept going when we already had reforms in place, process reforms in place.
Right.
They gave him refugee status and LPR, and then he got citizenship.
So in other words, each of those was sort of another opportunity, sort of another bite at the apple to do vetting. Even if they didn't do the vetting properly when he first came before 9/11, there were these multiple repeat opportunities to do vetting of the guy who was already here, right?
Yeah. And, it's not like you needed super secret intelligence to vet this guy. Anybody coming out of Bosnia, you should be checking of a certain age. You should be checking what they did.
Right.
And checking with the UN Human Rights Court. And that's what ICE Homeland Security investigations did. They had no trouble finding the full record and statements that he made back in the 90s, the late 90s, about that placing him at this camp.
What are some of the other cases that, newer cases that you've added over the past, whatever it is, year and a half, that illustrate this sort of falling down on the job, really, of kind of basic vetting?
Right. Well, there's the case of an 18-year-old Egyptian student of Virginia's George Mason University, got caught up in a plot to bomb Israel's consulate in New York just recently, 2024 case. That was a situation where he came in a couple of years earlier. It's unclear exactly from the court records how he came in, whether he crossed the border. Actually, I had somebody tell me that he came in on a visa of some sort, maybe as a student visa, or I can't really quite get at how he got in, but it was not over the border as a juvenile. But subsequent investigations showed that this guy was all over, even as a youngster, all over social media with jihad kind of ideology all over the place. And so vetters are supposed to be checking social media, at least under Trump 1.0. They started to require that everybody provide their social media accounts to adjudicators so they could go through it and check. But apparently they didn't with this case. And they would have picked off that this guy was a problem. So he comes in and the FBI gets wind of him on social media and arrested him on December 17th, 2024 for plotting a mass casualty attack on the Israeli consulate. And that's in the Eastern District of Virginia, that case. He'd come in 2022. It's just another one of these sort of moments when, you know, if the FBI was able to find it very relatively shortly after he entered, because they got onto it within a year of him entering the country, he didn't just suddenly radicalize. In other words, it's very reasonable to assume that he was already radicalized when he got in, from coming in from Egypt. And, you know, he almost, you know, went through with something like this. And now he's in our system and, you know, he's going to cost taxpayers all this money. The FBI had to get involved and he never should have been here. They should have kept him out. And maybe even if it meant keeping his family out too. And there he was at George Mason U studying information technology. That's another one of these many terrorism cases. In fact, I would say the majority of cases in our database are terrorism cases because those are pretty frequent in the United States, involving foreign students and foreigners coming in.
You would think, I mean, student from the Middle East, so he's a young person from the Middle East, you would think one of the first things they'd check would be social media. I mean, you look, if it's some 50-year-old lady from the Philippines or whatever who has a sibling and she's waited 8 years for her visa or something, okay, maybe you would check that anyway too, but the likelihood that person is active on social media is a lot less than a young person. It just seems like it's a no-brainer to have checked social media for stuff. Really, the problem, I mean, part of the problem here is you were referring to just the numbers of people coming in, and there's such pressure to issue visas that the State Department really does operate on what the motto of that, or the pre-9/11 motto or slogan of the Riyadh, Saudi Arabia consulate was, people got to have their visas. And until we change the perspective and say, no, people don't got to have their visas, the American people got to have protection, that's going to be hard to change. So is there maybe one other notable instance that you added to the database that might be worth talking about?
Yeah, I mean, there are plenty of these things. One I put in September 2024, a Russian national who crossed the southern border and later got convicted of terrorism crimes in federal courts in California. This guy, he was a Russian, but he was from the, you know, the areas like, you know, in and around Chechnya.
Right.
And so there's a kind of restive Muslim areas that are well known for producing, you know, ISIS fighters and that sort of thing. I'm not sure I can pronounce this right, but he was from the Kabardina-Balkaria area,
right,
the Republic.
It's close enough.
And yeah, he pleaded guilty in January 2024 of providing money to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS. That's the group that just took over Syria.
Oh, interesting.
U.S. designated, they used to be the al-Nusra Front. And he comes in over the border, and this was during the Trump 1.0.
Mm-hmm.
And keep in mind that, you know, the executive order says, you know, we're going to fix all the processes to put them back to where they were before Biden entered office. But I argue that really they got to go way back, way further. They've had problems, you know, going back, you know, through Obama, you know, all the way to present.
Right.
And, you know, this particular guy comes in over the border and he's with his wife and children. So he gets in under the Flores loophole. That there was a whole thing happening at that time, a big surge of family units. And, you know, maybe they weren't really looking that hard at family unit. You come in with your wife and kids, you know, you can't be that bad, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, except that this guy was a full-blown, you know, jihadist before he came in, fully down with HTS. Within 14 months of arriving and settling, the guy was sending money already overseas to his contacts with HTS. He was, all tied in with them already.
Right.
And they could have, any kind of vetting would have found his social media, which had it all on there.
Interesting.
And the FBI later were able to have no problem finding his, in fact, that's what tipped him off, is that he had it all up on his social media. And he had encrypted phone apps that he was communicating with very well-known HTS fundraisers and recruiters. But, came over the border during a big surge, and, nobody checked.
Right.
You're supposed to be checking all those people and really working, especially if they're coming from a place like that, which is very well known for its Islamic extremism.
Mm-hmm.
That should have been the first clue, that you do extra checking, even if there are children involved.
Right, right.
So then, we also had a lot of, I mentioned this, I'm not going to go through all of them, Afghan evacuees from Kabul. That's already been fairly well reported. I mean, there was an OIG report, I think the year before last, saying that, a lot of the people we put on military planes and flew them to, third countries and then flew them here, tens of thousands, that they had security problems, questions. They promised us that they fully vetted everybody on those planes.
Right.
But they didn't, including this guy. We put this out in December of 2024 and added him to the database, and the Afghan evacuee came in August 2021, and they promised us that he had been fully vetted. This guy served as a guard for the CIA in Afghanistan. So you would have thought, oh, well, the CIA guard, surely they checked him all up and down and in and out and everything else, right?
Yeah.
But it didn't happen. And he comes in on that humanitarian parole, settles in Oklahoma City, works as a Lyft driver and auto mechanic and all the rest of that. And then a few years later, they arrest him in a co-conspirator for a plot to conduct an election day terror attack, firearms attack.
Unbelievable.
In the United States for ISIS. And it turns out that he and a co-conspirator who also was brought in. And then, they barely caught this guy. This was like a nick of time kind of thing.
Right. Incredible. Yeah, I don't want to go through all the cases, both because we're out of time, but also, the database is there for, you've got a whole bunch of fields, that you can search for where they're from and who failed in the vetting, but also there's a narrative for each case that explains, what happened here. So it's the National Security Vetting Failures database. It's on the homepage at CIS.org. I say this with no relish, but almost certainty that there's going to be more cases to add to this, if only because other things will come up as the administration does this kind of retroactive vetting of people from special interest countries. That's what one of the things that this executive order the president signed does. Is that correct?
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, this is really a good time to draw attention back to a project like this, because there's nothing like this out there.
Right.
And to me, it serves as a pretty good roadmap for a new administration just trying to settle down with these new orders to fix everything and to start vetting. Really, they're saying everybody, including people who are already in the country, which is going to be interesting to see how they resource that. And, a lot of people from special interest countries in the Middle East that we just let in over the border, thousands and thousands of them, one of whom went on to do a terror attack in Chicago just in October against the Jewish community.
Right.
What did he know? What did they know about him, or what could they have found out about him? That sort of thing.
Right. Yeah. So unfortunately, there's probably going to be a lot more cases coming up, either, where they commit some kind of heinous act and, we find out about afterwards, or that they identify in doing this kind of retroactively doing the proper vetting that didn't get done. So when those cases come up, I'm sure you'll be on top of them, and we'll include them in the database and write about them at our blog post. And maybe next year or something, we'll do another podcast if there's been a lot more sort of news in the vetting area. So in the meantime, though, Todd Bensman, thanks for joining us. Keep up the good work, and we'll talk to you again in the future.
All right. Thanks for having me.
And finally, the president, in his address to a joint session of Congress this week, as all new presidents do when they make this quasi-State of the Union address, lay out the kind of things that they plan to do over the next 4 years. The interesting thing, though, in this case is that unlike most of his predecessors, the president actually has real accomplishments just in the first 6 weeks of his administration, and chief among them is the border. Todd Bensman wrote a piece he's saying the title is "The Greatest Mass Migration Border Crisis in U.S. History is Over," essentially declaring the border crisis over. I actually have a piece in Commonplace that makes the same kind of argument. We'll have links to both of them in the show notes. The point, of course, is that border crossings have collapsed. I mean, it's more than 90% drop in border crossings. The chief of the Border Patrol, Mike Banks, said it's the lowest levels of illegal immigration in recorded history, at least in, recorded history of the American border with Mexico. And this is a real thing. I mean, the border crisis has been broken. The back of it has been broken, and it's ended. That doesn't mean, though, that illegal immigration is over. The administration is going to have to stay vigilant to adapt the old saying, eternal vigilance is the price of border security. And there are going to be increased pressures on the border at various points. It could well be that the Trump effect of making smugglers and prospective illegal aliens kind of sit back to wait and see what's going to happen could wear off. There could be Mexico might stop helping at the border because their interruption of a lot of the smuggling has been a contributor to restoring control, and it only happened because Donald Trump threatened them with pain if they didn't cooperate, or any number of other things could happen. So my only point here is illegal immigration isn't over, but the mass crisis caused by Biden administration policies started on the day he was inaugurated a little more than 4 years ago is over. And that's a real accomplishment. It's good news, but it's provisional good news. As Todd said at the end of his post on this, the border crisis is over, at least for the next 4 years, and we'll see what happens in the future. Hopefully, we will have learned a lesson about maintaining control of the border and not letting it spin out of control, as happened because of Biden administration policies, but you never know. And so the point is we need to keep on this issue, and the center will, in fact, keep on this issue, both of immigration enforcement at the border and in the interior, and the legal immigration issue and all the various aspects of this issue going forward, because immigration is not a specific challenge that you meet and then it's over. Immigration is inherent. Immigration control and immigration management is inherent to being in the country business. It's like foreign policy or tax policy. It never goes away. It never will or can go away. And you always need to make sure you're running it in a way that's consistent with the national interest. So until next week, this is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center, signing off for Parsing Immigration Policy. Thanks to Brian Griffith, our producer. Thanks to all of you for listening, and I hope you'll tune in again next week.